Richmond, and I remember the game of Players Poker very dearly as well. I've written on Mother Jones. I've been involved with working on Mother Jones for a number of years, and I've published a few things on her. I thought it might be interesting to you, for me very briefly, to talk about why my interest in Mother Jones began. I grew up in mining country in Kansas, in southeastern Kansas. Lots of people think that we only grow wheat there, but there's also lots of mining that occurred there, even though my parents had a family farm instead of being involved in the mining industry. Also, for 8 years after I got married, we lived in a small town, Girard, Kansas, which at the turn of the century was the socialist hub of the United States. It had about 2,000 people in it, but it published the largest socialist newspaper in the country for a number of years. And so because of that, a number of those socialists came and visited there all of the time. People such as Eugene Debs, Mother Jones spent lots of time there. Helen Keller became a socialist there. Jane Addams spent lots of time there. And Clarence Darrow would occasionally show up as well to get the socialists out of jail for whatever reason they may have been thrown in there. And so in her autobiography, Mother Jones, a person who for 50 years didn't really have an abode, she said very famously one time, "My address is like my shoes, it travels with me." In her memoir, written in the last years of her life, said, "If there is any place in the country I could call home, it was the home of J.A. Whalen, the editor of the Appeal of Reason in Girard, Kansas." And when I was working on some of this, I could, in winter days when the leaves were gone, actually see the Whalen house from where I was writing things about Mother Jones. So that's part of my interest in her. If the early U.S. labor movement compiled a trilogy of industrial infamy, events of April 20th, 1914, the temporary strikers' tent colony outside of Ludlow, Colorado, would surely count among it. Then and there, enemies of unionism's increasing political muscle ignited a literal and metaphoric firestorm set within one of the bloodiest protracted altercations between U.S. capital and labor, the Colorado Coalfield War of 1913-1914. During a 14-month-long standoff's notoriety was its title as the most photographed labor conflict in the nation's coal mining history. Over several months, photographers ranging from coal company employees, photojournalists, amateur passers-by, and professional freelancers chronicled in hundreds of images a sobering slice of lower working class life in isolated coal communities largely invisible to a citizenry daily comforted by coal. Searing pictures surrounding April 20th, its explosive aftermath, and industry propaganda campaigns to contain the damage added to a growing visual album underscoring the power of images and spectacle in early labor struggles, among the first U.S. social movements to exploit varied forms of rhetorical display to advance human rights. Because the early U.S. industrial labor movement is an epic tale, this essay confines exploration of its use of visual politics to one principal figure, an elderly white-haired widow, and the movement's most charismatic and effective union agitator, Mary Harris Jones, and to two representative events, the Colorado Coalfield War, especially Ludlow, and the earlier 1903 marches of textile mill children led by Jones to lobby for federal child labor reforms. Both episodes speak to two chief and interrelated dimensions of Jones's legendary rhetorical prowess. First, her acute understanding of the force of the eye in the form of photographs, parades, and other theatrical events for varied audiences. And second, her marshaling of motherhood and idealized childhood to expose industry hypocrisy and subvert capital's aims. Despite the porous overlap of her employment of images and spectacle, I treat Colorado and the children's marches to highlight and analyze her use of photographs and pageantry, respectively. I will begin with the Colorado Coalfield War to situate Ludlow's visual and performative legacy, segue into Jones's biographical baptism into ocular epistemology, and then analyze her use of photography in public appearances. I then turn to her signature pageants of poverty by focusing on perhaps the most widely publicized of her countless spectacles, the Children's Marches of 1903. I begin with Ludlow. Among September snow and rain in 1913, roughly 200,000 mining family members had migrated to a dozen improvised canvas outposts dotting the Colorado landscape since their immediate eviction from company-issued hovels for holding firm in bargaining with Colorado Fuel and Iron and its principal owners, the John D. Rockefeller oil tycoons and the nation's wealthiest family. At the time, Colorado presided as the deadliest U.S. state for coal miners, doubling fatalities in a nation where average deaths tripled Europe's most hazardous coal fields. Even so, Colorado miners' demands privileged autonomy and sustenance over safety, wages for unrequired, unpaid dead work, such as laying track, an elected checkman to verify dug coal weights, elimination of paid deductions for coal impurities, a long-delayed wage hike for tonnage mined, and ironically, insistence that bosses follow already existing Colorado state laws outlining maximum work hours and stipulating cash wages rather than scrip or paper coupons, redeemable only for wildly inflated company housing and company-controlled supplies and services. But most irreconcilable was managers' refusal to recognize a union with collective clout to police management practice. Beyond battling hunger and an exceptionally unforgiving winter, 4 feet of snow during much of the winter, 1,200 striking mining families huddled outside Ludlow, the largest of the improvised canvas ghettos, for 7 months had endured a smorgasbord of political intimidations, daily searchlight and machine gun surveillance, coiled barbed wire dumped in drinking wells, a roaming death special machine gun armored car, random sniper fire, frequent beatings, suspension of both habeas corpus and civil rights, enabling capricious mass jailing, and a saber-slashing cavalry assault, injuring several women, protesting the illegal incarceration in nearby Trinidad of the then 83-year-old Mother Jones. On the morning of April 20th, Colorado State Militia and deputized coal company hirelings began spraying the Ludlow campsite with machine gun fire, triggering a day-long pitched battle with weaker armed rifle-bearing strikers. Hours into the melee, a lieutenant fond of calling himself and his band of horseback soldiers, quote, Jesus Christ, who must be obeyed, replied to the plea by the colony's leader to negotiate a ceasefire this way. First handcuffing the colony chief before bludgeoning him conscious, soldiers then executed him and his truth-seeking comrades and displayed their riddled corpses as warnings to others for challenging capital supremacy, a class version of lynching. Around twilight, militia launched their final assault. Soaking tent homes in kerosene, the poor man's light Rockefeller Sr. called the cheap oil that helped build his massive fortune. They torched them and then looted the colony's humble treasures. When dawn broke, Ludlow families canvassing the smoking ruins for remnants of their threadbare lives amid armed soldiers unearthed another grisly price of their rebellion. In one bunker previously dug under tents as havens from periodic flying lead lay the suffocated corpses of 2 pregnant women and 11 children, several just a few months old. So here are some of the bodies in Ludlow. This is the whole where the women and children were lost. And here is a picture of one of many pictures of the Red Cross coming in to recover bodies. Coined the Ludlow Massacre by the United Mine Workers of America, the carnage proved incendiary. For 10 days, outraged citizens joined vengeful strikers along a 40-mile corridor in burning coal stipples and management offices and exchanging gunfire with militia and coal company hirelings, a battle finally quelled by the arrival of federal troops whom the strikers refused to fight. When the strike limped to its end in December, after UMWA relief coffers had run dry, violence had claimed nearly 70 lives, with exponentially more wounded, still but a sliver of several hundred annual Colorado mining casualties. The Colorado Coalfield War has spawned numerous studies and books, among them former Senator and presidential candidate George McGovern's published doctoral treatise and Upton Sinclair's 1917 novel, King Coal. Despite its notoriety, the conflict serves as what Kenneth Burke terms a representative anecdote for the depths to which Gilded Age capital and its collaborators occasionally descended to crush organized labor. In feudal-like West Virginia alone, where mining deaths, accident, and disease typically were fivefold Europe's average, scores of war zone fatalities included the 1903 wee-hour assassinations of sleeping suspected Union sympathizers in their Paint Creek shacks, and bombing victims during the 1921 Blair Mountain Strike, the singular time U.S. government air squadrons have dropped weapons on its own citizens. The Colorado Coalfield War resonated so strongly in part for its sensational state killings by arson of mothers and children, but also, I suggest, for the plethora of photographs recording for all to see the various fingers of the mining industry's iron fist. To compare 2 months into the Colorado walkout, a false cry of fire by anti-union stewards in a crowded union hall on Christmas Eve during the Copper Mountain miners' strike in Calumet, Michigan, where the dozens trampled to death in the ensuing stampede included 62 children, generated fewer pictures and thus far less ink. But Colorado visuals of hard scrabble shanties, gritting militia manning machine guns, the torched ruins of Ludlow and the previously demolished Forbes colony, the Death Hole Pit, and the funeral processions honoring Ludlow's slain were among the vast warehouse of speaking images from which varied parties drew in grappling with open armed class warfare and taming feared class revolution exploding shortly across the globe from Mexico to Russia. Colorado Coalfield photographs animated special congressional hearings convened on mining conditions, further inflamed labor papers, and punctuated the public talk of Mother Jones throughout the remainder of her career. The frozen stills of brute industrial peonage also thawed public apathy of the mainstream press and the public, as few, if any, U.S. conflicts had before or since. The New York Times, as one example, compared Ludlow victims to trapped rats and termed Ludlow, quote, a story of horror unparalleled in the history of industrial warfare. Public outcry over Ludlow murders and threats of retaliation in turn prompted a Rockefeller media blitz to rehabilitate the further vilified Rockefeller image, earning Standard Oil consultant Ivy Lee, whose portfolio would later include Germany's Third Reich, stature as the alleged father of public relations. Particularly astute was John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s autumn journey to Colorado coal fields, where reports and images of the financier chatting with coal miners, holding their children, and dancing with their wives generated headlines. Rockefeller machinations momentarily charmed even the crusty Mother Jones, whose unlawful imprisonment and multiple deportations from the state, ironically, had been engineered by coal industry clout. Roundly criticized as gullible by labor comrades, Jones defended her uncharacteristic mercy towards the Standard Oil heir by invoking the visual and experiential as routes to social truth or theoria, a term originating in literal sight. To illustrate, mere months following Colorado strikers' concession to an agreement Jones vehemently opposed, she nonetheless remarked in an interview, "Rockefeller Jr. is part of a system that he was born into, that he cannot help. Only by going down into Colorado for himself, by seeing the thing on a level plane, can he help the workers. I know Rockefeller wants to do the right thing, but he is blind. How can he see?" Jones has expressed faith here in the ocular and experiential as key to nourishing moral action, reflects both her tortured history of witnessing imperiled bodies and her 50-year crusade in making the nation see class injustice. Born into tenant poverty and revolt in Ireland sometime in the 1830s, a young Mary Harris experienced her grandfather hung for insurrection, witnessed soldiers destroy the very bones of her home, seeking her insurgent father, and gazed with 5-year-old eyes on British militia marching past her window with the heads of Irish rebels impaled on bayonets. In her later U.S. years, she watched her husband and all 4 of her children perish in a week from yellow fever, and then shortly thereafter looked on alone as her home, livelihood, and other few worldly possessions turned to ashes in Chicago's Great Fire. Witnessing thus birthed her trust in foundational truths midwived by literal sight, impelled her fearless courting of martyrdom, and helped position her as the early labor movement's savviest practitioner of rhetorical display, the visual, the ritualistic, and the theatrical. Legendary as the early labor movement's most spellbinding orator, who within hours could convert a lopsided vote against a walkout into a steely resolve to strike, Mother Jones nonetheless regarded the eye as the most forceful in conveying the anguish of industrial slavery. Quote, "Scribbling," she once said, "has no effect on the public mind. If you show real evil and wake up the sleepy, indifferent public, you will get these conditions changed." End quote. Her trust in literal witness as eclipsing the ear as the pathway to knowledge resonates in her hauntingly poetic reply to a reporter's query in Ludlow's wake about what had prompted her crusade. And Jones says, "That is the question that 40 million other fools before you have asked. I was born of the struggle and the torment and the pain, a child of the wheel, a brat of the cogs, a woman of the dust. And so how can you ask? And how can I tell you when I began to care? You ask because very probably none of you know. You haven't seen our lives as we live them out there in Colorado. We can tell you and you can listen, but no tragedy was ever comprehended that went from the mouth to the ear. It has to pass from the eye to the soul." In what follows, I treat Mother Jones as a representative anecdote in excavating the rhetorical ocular in the industrial labor movement, among the earliest domestic human rights crusades to exploit rhetorical display to mobilize constituencies, resist oppression, court public sympathy, and refigure national identity. Specifically, I focus on 2 key features of Mother Jones's showing forth. First, as I said, her keen appreciation of the camera's potency for varied audiences. And second, her trademark spectacles, ritualizing rebellion, showcasing resolve, and also generating publicity. Jones's visual theatrics indicted capital for various crimes and lobbied for labor reforms. But their undergirth was always epideictic, which Jeffrey Walker calls the basic rhetorical mode. The suasive power of, quote, demonstration, display, or showing forth the epideixis of things, he claims, leads an audience to contemplation, theoria, possible insight, and the formation of opinions on philosophical, social, ethical, and cultural concerns. Epideictic, he argues, cultivates the basic codes by which a society lives and by which its individual members identify themselves. Epideictic shapes the deep commitments and presuppositions that underlie and ultimately determine decisions and debate in pragmatic forums. Epideictic suasion is not limited to reinforcing existing ideologies, but can transform or challenge conventional beliefs. As Walker here suggests, epideictic may cast audiences not simply as spectators in the Aristotelian sense, but also as ethical actors, given moral display may influence individual civic conduct. Despite advancing age, outdated matronly attire, and aesthetic lifestyle, Mother Jones was no Luddite. Early on, embracing the camera as a potent developing technology capable of refuting denial of industrial conditions and piercing social conscience. Cumbersome photographic modes in use since around her birth occasionally had provided shadowy glimpses into lower working class life, but revolutionary photographic advancements in the 1880s coincided roughly with Jones's first estimated labor actions, among them her apprenticeship with the flamboyant populist Jacob Coxey in his 1894 publicity march of unemployed to the nation's capital to lobby for government work projects. And an aside is they all got arrested for walking on the grass. Soon after, the progressive era ushered in overtly politicized documentary photojournalism, illustrated by Jacob Ries's 1890 expose, How the Other Half Lives, recording the bleak underbelly of working class life in New York City tenements. By 1900, introduction of the dollar brownie camera meant increasingly less could escape the lens, including occasional glimpses of open class warfare in God-forsaken coal camps where miners who rarely saw the color of their children's eyes in sunlight, and sometimes worked 7 days a week under constant watch of armed company guards, teetered on the precipice of starvation. A nomad frequently operating in stealth under dangerous conditions, Mother Jones left an incomplete trail of her visual prowess. Reporters sometimes accompanying her in wading frigid creeks under cloak of darkness, typically fixed on the broader dimensions of her mesmerizing appeal for the workers she empowered. Even existing full transcripts of her public statements, including during congressional testimony, honed in on transcribing her fiery words, with stenographers noting only parenthetically, the speaker exhibits photographs. Still extant remains of her correspondence and public talk testify to her robust appreciation of pictures and exposing what she termed, quote, horrors which cannot be depicted by the human pen, end quote. A view later repeated by Lewis Hines's oft-quoted claim, quote, if I could tell the story of child labor in words, I would not need to lug around a camera. For her own part, Jones has viewed photographs as a means to terrify labor adversaries, mobilize workers, and engage the public with class injustice. In one surviving letter, for example, a comrade reports mailing her photographs and searching for others she might use. Preceding her signature parades, she sometimes schooled marchers on how to comport themselves most advantageously before the moving picture camera, and her common orders in public talks to put that down, Mr. Newspaperman, sometimes included photographic stage directions. Jones's reminder to workers of anti-labor stewards' fear of the camera as evidentiary proof is illustrated in a repeated tale of a reporter jailed simply for interviewing her. And she says, quote, it was the most amusing thing you ever saw. Hollis had a Kodak with him when they arrested him, and the two armed guards held it like it was a bomb, end quote. And Rockefeller Jr. himself repeatedly recoiled from Ludlow images during congressional hearings, even putting his hands in front of his face to avoid seeing the grainy snapshot submitted by a mother of the laid-out corpse of her young son slain while comforting his terrified young sister. Did I miss that? Okay. Given the inexactitude of historical records, the precise images Mother Jones occasionally exhibited in her speeches unfortunately remain captive to speculation. Yet clues provided in her recorded surrounding talk guide my treatment of ways in which such visual tokens functioned rhetorically in her hands to puncture calcified public indifference, challenge adversaries, and mobilize and empower her labor constituency. For neutral and skeptical audiences, photographs of industrial malfeasance worked in multiple ways. Images of machine guns, corpses, and charred, torched ruins of daily life helped foster for audiences living in relative comfort what Burke calls a new perspective by incongruity, where symbolic clash shatters previous orientations, thereby opening space for fresh outlooks. Illustrative of Visuality's fracturing force is Christine Harold and Kevin Michael DeLuca's argument that the, quote, dialogue between photos of the mutilated body of Emmett Till and his smiling Christmas snapshots on his casket intensified revulsion of his lynching. Lawrence Prelly's claim that the statue of African-American Arthur Ashe amid the Confederate heroes on Richmond's, Virginia's famed Monument Avenue is, quote, jarringly incongruous with the embodied Confederate story. And Davy Johnson's conclusion in Echoes of Burke of explosive Birmingham images in 1963, quote, photographs, Johnson writes, can be epiphanic, forcing a psychic transformation of the citizenry by rupturing imagined conceptions of identity, end quote. Black and white images indeed often proved exactly that, drawing in starkest relief the gulf between alleged moral conviction and common practice, thereby erasing alleged gray areas to which moderates sometimes safely clung. True to Burke's notion of deliberate misfits, Mother Jones sometimes explicitly employed visual juxtaposition to shatter cemented social premises servicing class oppression. During congressional hearings, 3 days after Ludlow, she answered pressing questions about merits of free enterprise and open shops by couching her proposal for government ownership of mines in the epidictic virtue of communal obligation. She then underscored via filmed stark contrasts. And here's what Mother Jones says. It is the duty of every man and woman who has consideration for the people of this nation just to see how much money those fellows made in 1912 and see the starving wretches, exhibiting some photographs. They say she exhibits some photographs. Whoops. Okay, where am I now? Okay, I got ahead here. All right, Mark, I need, okay. Is this where I was? Sorry about that. All right, exhibiting some photographs. All right, then she says, now here is a picture of the tents. Here is a picture of the home of the millionaire. Here is a picture of the money the industrialists made in 1 year alone. Immediately positioning photographs of ousted workers exiled to makeshift cloth homes in frozen wilderness. Now you get to see them again. Against the polished, top-hatted, and silver-caned opulence of Rockefeller industrial royalty, whose one sprawling country estate alone was 5 times the acreage of Monaco, turned in mere seconds the Protestant work ethic's hallowed promise of prosperity for industriousness inside out. Notable in her major premise, when she says, "It is the duty of every man who has consideration for the people of this nation to see," is the implicit expectation that true citizens with moral fiber will follow an irrefutable logic of shortened premises supplied by the eye, a trust evident in the bald simplicity of her captioned talk. Here's a picture of the tents, here's a picture of the home of the millionaire. Grounded in epideictic tenets of community values of care and obligation, she invites audiences to complete their own forensic and deliberative conclusions, not simply about assigning blame, but searching for legislative answers. Replying here upon the vocabulary of witness, more than words, Jones bluntly compressed a compelling narrative of class injustice meriting political remedy. Certain enduring Colorado Coalfield War photographs also illustrate what Roland Barthes calls the punctum of an image: a prick, a sting, a speck, a cut, a little hole, quote, "an element that arises from a scene, shoots out like an arrow and pierces." A photograph's punctum is that which pricks me, but also bruises me, is poignant to me. Unlike what he terms the banal studium of many-stage photographs eliciting a distance-like, dislike response to the picture's artistic or even political intentions or merits, for example, an image's punctum engages a viewer through the subjective, personal, emotional response of tenderness or loving. Images from Ludlow that recur repeatedly on various labor websites nearly a century later suggest the subjective pathetic force of punctum. Pictures of iron bedposts and bed springs or crooked kitchen stoves, stoically resisting Ludlow's blaze, potentially sting and move by inviting an enigmatic imagining of a before in the images recorded after. As Barthes writes, the punctum is a kind of subtle beyond, as if the image launched desire beyond what it permits us to see. Punctum has more or less a power of expansion. Punctum is, in addition, what the reader adds to a photograph, but what is nonetheless already there. And indeed, photographs of chaotic, charred Ludlow ruins, totally absent human life, necessarily tap personal experiences of the viewer, conjuring haunted, poignant ghosts of meals cooked and shared, and the comforting relief of bedtime and the warmth of its intimate encounters. Their emotive potency, Barthes suggests, quote, derives from a kind of second sight, which may carry us back to somewhere in ourselves. The prick here in a photo of deliberate destruction is not unlike perhaps the most compelling exhibit in the U.S. Holocaust Museum. The piles and piles of wrinkled shoes requiring visitors to paint in the lives of the lost persons who once wore them and felt their initial pinch. So too, the photograph of a lone slumped figure facing the camera amid Ludlow rubble potentially lacerates on multiple levels. His posture suggests soulful weariness, amplified by a blank expression, reflecting the incomprehensible weight of his surroundings, and may additionally convey being startled by the photograph's intrusion into his sorrow. Yet his position in the near left of the image's frame, with the ruins stretching behind him, also enable a poignantly hopeful reading of trudging through and also forward despite the horrors at his back. Beyond recording evil in humanity, the photograph's unstaged humanness likewise aids healing by its subtle reminder of the curative of care. To walk among the indescribable filth and stench of smoldering ruins and rotting flesh, this figure, this anonymous shell-shocked man, has chosen to keep his jacket, white shirt, and hat, perhaps his best, in a eulogistic gesture of tenderness or loving for the community destroyed. Jones also employed photographs as a first negative argument during charged encounters with labor enemies, converting public spaces into courtrooms where she presided as prosecutor and judge and oscillated between casting various audience members as jurors and defendants. In a 1920 public meeting heavily infiltrated by hissing coal company operatives, Jones countered open hostilities with a rapid-fire, damning photographic evidence mirroring the literal weaponry and images she displayed. And so I'll tell you what she says. She goes, "I want you to see this," exhibits a photograph. "Do you see it? It is a rapid-fire gun, a machine gun. Here's another one," exhibiting another picture. "There is the funeral of the 15 babes that they murdered in Ludlow, Colorado. I have the pictures. Here are some more of the dead who were murdered by those machine guns. Here are some more of them. Here I want to show you. Here are Baldwin Felt's men that left West Virginia and went to Colorado, and local authorities put the state uniform on them. Look at that." And she shows another picture. "This is the blood of the babes that stained the mountain." Again, by juxtaposing images of machine guns and uniformed soldiers, funerals of infants and corpses set against burnt skeletons of communal life in visual enumeration, Jones ruptured possible presumptions such battles were fair moral fights. Such photographs, accompanied by her defiant pronouncement, "I have the pictures," functioned in an era of faith in photographic technological realism akin to contemporary DNA. Much of photographer's magic, Susan Sontag reminds, is an image's ethos as, quote, "something directly stenciled off the reel," end quote. A sentiment Barthes couches as a picture's undeniable testament to what has been. More ironically apt in the context of bloodshed and sneering oppression here is his claim that the photograph is violent, not because it shows violent things, but because it fills the sight by force. In it, nothing can be refused or transformed, end quote. Still, Jones's forensic showing forth did not end only with those crimes captured by the lens. Rather, her surrounding talk of other class violence render such photographs what Kara Finnegan terms visual synecdoches, images, quote, representative of an oppressive system, one interlude in a larger drama. Varied meanings of photographs, of course, develop in the darkroom of interplay with other texts. And Jones's withering indictments of class violence through pictures were embedded within detailed narratives of collective guilt, extending to public apathy and workers' own complicit poor judgment and cowardice. Her passing sentence via graphic images, she further animated in words, demanded all viewers, oppressors, oppressed, and the indifferent, contemplate and judge themselves. Her talk surrounding the photographs she displayed amplified their power as what Bruce Gronbeck terms hailing devices to spur exercise of individual agency true to a personal sense of self. As Sontag writes, quote, "Photographs cannot create a moral position, but they can reinforce one, and they can build a nascent one." At the same time, for constantly beleaguered lower-class workers, especially isolated rural coal company mining families living among the farthest removes from social notice and concern, the pictures Mother Jones displayed potentially functioned in more far-reaching ways. In an era before Kinko's, PowerPoint, and ubiquitous big screens, assuming that most persons, in audiences of sometimes thousands, even could see from distant perches the photographs she exhibited, would be naive. Nonetheless, her dramatic waving of pictures, coupled with continual reminders of their very existence, "I have the pictures," offered a psychic empowering balm by bearing tangible witness to the workers' lived experiences. As Barthes states, quote, "In photography, I can never deny that the thing has been there. Every photograph is a certificate of presence." Sontag concurs, noting photographs are, quote, a way of certifying experience and a, quote, defense against anxiety, helping people take possession of a space in which they are insecure, end quote. Bitter fruits of oppression, after all, are not simply material, brutal as they sometimes prove to be. The tentacles of oppression birthed by materiality also wormed their way into the victim's mind, instilling fear, worthlessness, and despair, fortified by public denial or cavalier dismissal. As Finnegan claims in her study of commissioned Depression-era photographs of the unemployed and poor, certain pictures of struggling, hardworking, impoverished elevated the subject's status, thereby troubling social privilege. Drawing upon Sontag's claim that, quote, to photograph is to confer importance, end quote, thus making photography what she calls a tool of power, Finnegan argues certain widely circulated portraits of working poor conferred on them a seldom offered dignity and respect, a claim buttressed by Graham Clark's argument that Dorothea Lange's portraiture, quote, insisted upon the significance and stature of her subjects, if for no other reason than the fact of their existence and the emotional response of their condition. In similar fashion, photographs of mining families lying before humble homes, engaged in daily chores and recreation, threatened and killed, and marching with stoic dignity in lengthy columns honoring martyred comrades, not only weaved a human narrative with effective power to nudge a nation, but provided a modicum of psychic relief to workers by writing the lives they enjoyed and battled daily into existence on the public page. This is the picture of the Tika's funeral, the colony leader, and you can see how long it goes. It's a really quite impressive photo. A photograph not only is like its subject, Sontag writes, but is in homage to its subject. To be sure, images of brutal violence viewed by the oppressed can cut both ways, for their paralyzing terror or igniting and fortifying rebellion. As Harold and DeLuca argue, pictures of Till's lynched body consumed and shared by African Americans akin to the Eucharist steeled their resistance, a forerunner to the use of postcards bought in the thousands by Belfast citizens in 1974, capturing Irish troubles they personally witnessed daily. So too, Jews across the globe still purchase souvenirs containing Holocaust images as sacred memorials, markers of identity, and totems to ward off that horror's recurrence. In somewhat similar fashion, workers employed photographs of labor's most willing martyr, Mother Jones herself, as talismans to conjure hope, comfort, and courage against formidable odds. Replicating the use of religious iconography, some miners adorned their humble shanty walls with pictures of labor's mother of sorrows and pinned her face to their lapels during protest marches, echoing practices of resistance people's use of Our Lady of Guadalupe, including during the Mexican Revolution, where Madre Jones reigned as their living patroness saint of class struggle. Beyond photographs, parades, street theater, and other visual performances also proved chief among Mother Jones's repertoire of human sights to champion human rights, methods long used by labor. Some 800 striking female shoe factory workers in 1860, for example, had been the first social rebels to appropriate the epideictic revolutionary spawn parade ritual to exert cultural presence, call political leaders into account, demand reforms, challenge proposed policies, and expose tangible hypocrisy of national ideals. For her part, Jones's trademark, quote, pageants of poverty included marches, sometimes in the several thousands, of children accompanied by marching bands, parades of workers who sometimes ceremoniously crowned her as labor's queen, and mop and broom brigades of ferocious mining wives armed only with clanging pots and pans, red pepper, hat pins, and wailing babies who petrified scabs, spooked mine mules, shamed timid husbands and sons, and perplexed weary jailers who often relented by releasing the unruly singing mothers and their howling broods. Explicitly borrowing language of the photograph, Jones remarked that an army of resolute, angry women with toddlers in tow makes a wonderfully spectacular picture. And here's a couple of different examples of the many marches that she led. She's in the front right here in this one. Attention generated in Jones's frequent theatrics came to concern even UMWA leadership, who worried the spectacles siphoned worker energies and public attention from specifics of contract disputes. Notoriously insubordinate, the maverick Jones nonetheless ignored official directives to desist, aware, as was the later Martin Luther King Jr., that such theatrical events help focus rather than divert the public eye. Just prior to the Colorado strike, she, echoing Burke's focus on the dramatic, including the disruptive cheekiness of the court jester, said to a reporter initially wary of her reputation as the most dangerous woman in America the following. Here's what she said. "I have said that I hate violence. I favor drama. We must wake the sleeper somehow, and where blindness can be healed by shock, we must provide the shock. Sometimes it hurts a little, but it helps the patient afterward, for lo, it makes him see. The Coxey's Army's march to Washington was a great joke, but it helped mightily to bring about good roads." And demonstrations are good things for labor in these learning days. They are good advertising, and the serious progressive drama, as well as comic opera, needs advertising, end quote. Emblematic of what Kevin DeLuca calls an image event, and he and Jennifer Peoples term critique through spectacle, were Jones's two marches in 1903 of striking Philadelphia textile workers, including mill children, to lobby for federal child regulations, a long-standing cause of hers that she convinced skeptical and largely disinterested union officials would generate sympathy for the general strike. For showcasing several thousand working children in a demonstration in the city of brotherly love, she then fashioned a highly publicized 120-mile trek of strikers, including 100 children, across 3 states to draw attention to the rapidly rising number of working youth, which had doubled between 1880 and 1900 to 1.7 million, even as the nation, ironically, embarked upon a profound cultural shift in sacralizing childhood. Like other states conveniently turning a blind eye to their own child labor laws, Pennsylvania commonly employed children, some as young as 7, who worked 60 hours a week for $2, the lowest salary rung, rationalized by mill bosses with the perverse logic that such children had no dependent children to support. Reportedly inspired by the throngs turning out for the Liberty Bells tour, Mother Jones's Children March featured numerous symbolic nods to colonial rebellion. Mill children, sometimes dressed as Minutemen, one member swung a red, white, and blue baton, another hoisted enormous stars and stripes, a fife and drum corps played patriotic songs, and the contingent occasionally camped on Revolutionary War battle sites where she delivered rousing speeches comparing class struggles to British tyrannies, catalyzing George Washington's earlier ragtag brigades. Striking youngsters also carried placards mimicking hallowed Revolutionary-era sentiments. "We ask only for justice," "Prosperity, where is our share?" and in echoes of Patrick Henry, 55 hours or nothing. But particularly bruising were banners reminding spectators that occasional theatrical costumes notwithstanding, the marching company of mill children were simply that, mere children and not real soldiers. We want time to play, and we want to go to school. For onlookers subject to escalating cultural rhetoric, romanticizing childhood, or with relatively cosseted offspring of their own frail youngsters bearing placards identifying as textile workers, set against common pleadings for common childhood pursuits of happiness, created incongruities with fracturing force capable of forging new perspectives on standard factory practices. And so here you see the longevity of one photograph, this one here, in contemporary accounts of Jones's image event, again speaks to the unsettling prick of punctum. Amid a line of upright rebels dutifully holding signs for the camera is a young boy in the front row, crouched with hands on knees and feet turned in and laser eyes, as if anticipating a ball somewhere coming into play. Within the photograph studium of documented rebellion, the boys and choreographed movement is the, quote, accident Barthes describes in rupturing the unary of staged photographs or news images whose literalness may shout, but they rarely wound. Here the uncontained, wiggly energy of youth pierces not only because it carries viewers back to a place within themselves, but also invites contemplation on this child's adult after, the slow erosion of that endearing spirit glimpsed by more years of mundane factory toil. Quote, photography, Barthes argues, is subversive, not when it frightens, repels, or even stigmatizes, but when it is pensive, when it thinks, meaning inducing us vaguely to think. Jones's visual stunts critiquing class colonialism were not confined to exploiting 1776 symbols. On the eve of the march, she invoked ocular language in forecasting its contours to a reporter, and she says, I am going to picture capitalism and caricature the money mad. I am going to show Wall Street the flesh and blood from which it squeezes its wealth, end quote. And so she did. At Princeton, Jones displayed illiterate, thin, stoop-shouldered children with gnarled or missing fingers, complements of mill machinery, as visual, quote, textbooks on economics to the Ivy League crowd. In practices echoing medieval carnival, detailed by Mikhail Bakhtin, she also mixed the serious and the satirical. Along the route, thin-maimed youngsters performed skits lampooning the preening luxuries of Mr. Capital and Mrs. Mill Owner, augmented with mocking effigies of starched industrial moguls and their heavily encrusted, painted, perfumed, and feathered wives. Consistent with Saturnalia rituals, which temporarily inverted social relations between rulers and ruled through gross ridicule, such maneuvers momentarily reversed social hierarchy in grotesque displays of class privilege, visually converting unbridled pursuits of wealth from the sacred to profane. At Coney Island, amid more well-heeled vacationers enjoying sand, surf, and carnival rides, Jones placed her young rebels in empty zoo cages, where they clung to iron bars as visual metaphoric commentary on the beastliness of industrial servitude. There, during her speech before a giant image of Roman emperors with thumbs down while the zoo lions roared in the background, she said in farcical tones, and here's what she said, "You see those monkeys in the cages? Professors are trying to teach them to talk. The monkeys are too wise, though, for they fear that then the manufacturers might buy them for slaves in their factories." Jones's march also illustrated her hallmark talent for improvisation, which contributed to her unrivaled success in organizing non-English-speaking workers. Following the Burkean notion of using all there is in a particular moment, she would sometimes speak to fresh immigrants via bands, record players, photographs, effigies, visual aids of ousted mining families, and other theatrical displays. During the Children's March, when crowds and press attention dwindled, she rejuvenated interest by spontaneously switching its New York City finale to the Oyster Bay retreat of President Theodore Roosevelt, which she publicized by sharing plaintive letters to him with the press. Roosevelt's clumsy refusal to grant her an audience to her and 3 exhausted children rendered him as the perfect enemy or foil, symbolizing government indifference to industrial malfeasance. Although Mother Jones's lengthy publicity stunt did not immediately usher in reform she hoped, its theatrics left its mark on the retina of public consciousness and identity. The 1903 spectacle paved ways for later child labor campaigns, notably Heinz's famous photograph portfolio, commissioned by the National Child Labor Committee, which took the nation by storm in 1916. That year, Woodrow Wilson, by then not president of Jones's Princeton stop, but president of the country, convened recalcitrant senators to successfully break a stalemate, producing the first federal child labor laws. The photographs of class warfare and the trademark demonstrations Mother Jones led testify to the rhetorical power of images and spectacle employed by the early labor movement, visual precursors to tactics adopted in other social movements. Examining early class struggles further expands the scholarly contextual aperture in considering rhetorical display as potent vehicles to advance human rights. Moreover, detailing specific instances of class conflict, which images inherently force, refocuses treatment of class to lived conditions rather than more abstract theoretical discussions distanced from materiality such theories ostensibly embrace. Mother Jones herself, who helped launch the Socialist Party's most influential newspaper, and the only female signature on the founding manifesto of the Industrial Workers of the World in 1906, often expressed disdain for comrades preoccupied by intellectual class debates, dismissing them as hot air oratory and scribbling removed from battles in the trenches. Additionally, the events described here and various responses underscore the interplay among class, race, and gender in focusing the public eye. First, one might reasonably doubt whether Ludlow would have seared the nation's conscience so intently had its charred victims been black, or what Mother Jones herself sometimes racistly referred to as, quote, heathen Chinese. Despite lingering anti-immigration fears, images of tow-headed mill and mining children and embattled European families resonated among the poor privileged in part by providing a looking glass through which white onlookers were forced to contemplate their own reflection, albeit in more humble clothes. Second, prevailing gender codes exalting motherhood as woman's primary mission not only cushioned criticism of Mother Jones's visual militance, but aided in generating public sympathy. Whereas Jennifer Boor argues parading suffragists, and she says very presence in the street, challenged traditional notions of femininity and restrictions of women's conduct, Jones's armies of angry mothers and her frequent parading of children embodied duties fundamental to womanhood, especially motherhood's fierce protectiveness, unencumbered by social rank. As Prelli argues, displays of identity convey, quote, what ought and not ought to be, unquote, which informs why the New York Times claimed that the most searing testimony in congressional hearings over its 15 months was by one of two young mothers surviving Ludlow's black hole, describing her frantic, failed efforts to save her 3 young babies, first from bullets and then from fire. Yet despite the camera's power, photography, Sontag reminds us, inevitably entails a certain patronizing of reality. Cameras miniaturize experiences. Put differently, photography, as Barth notes, is a kind of metonymy, a substitution or reduction of life. As a 1925 report by the U.S. Coal Commission on coal towns most in West Virginia stated, quote, in the worst of the company-controlled communities, the state of disrepair runs beyond the power of verbal description or even photographic illustration, since neither can portray the abandoned dejection or reproduce the smells, the medley of odors. Finally, Mother Jones's rhetorical displays illustrate how epideictic ends, praise and blame, honor and dishonor, need not be either or, but can be both and. In her ands, the ocular honored hallowed motherhood and childhood, worship of work, and sacred revolutionary impulses defining national identity. But it coincidentally blamed and shamed a people's failure in meeting that very vision of themselves. Using the eye, Jones melded past, present, and future in a generic swirl, and in so doing exemplified the most radical, progressive era efforts to recenter or refigure identity by a nation increasingly reliant on the eye for truth as it looked for its essential soul. Thank you.